We'll start the second day with some opening remarks from Molly Wagster. She's the Chief of the Behavioral and Systems Neuroscience branch in the Division of Neuroscience and our boss. And I'll turn it over to you, Molly.
Thanks, Lucy. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Traffic Exclamation Point workshop. Yesterday we heard a number of terrific talks, primarily about impact from air pollution from traffic, but also about noise pollution on older individuals' health and well-being. And the discussion yesterday, for those of you who weren't able to attend, was very thoughtful. And we look forward to more of the same this afternoon. Today, the focus of the talks will have more of an emphasis on noise pollution, and we're also going to have an entire session on the built environment, how noise and air pollution may be both exacerbated and mitigated through design of where we live and work. Intimate, smaller scale workshops such as these serve a dual purpose for the NIA. And we hope for investigators and all of you as well. They serve as an educational tool and as a catalyst for future research. We recognize the importance of bringing people together from adjacent and disparate fields, and to allow for fostering of conversation and exchange for which typically no other forum exists. It allows us to learn about key findings from others' research, but also about the challenges. And whether we find that the challenges are very different or common, we can then put that knowledge to work. So we heard yesterday, and we'll hear more today, about creative ways and creative measures to understand components of traffic pollution that impact the brain and through what pathways, at the structural, the cellular, neurochemical, and molecular levels. So thanks to everyone who participated yesterday, both the speakers and attendees. Thanks to Lucy Roberts for targeting this topic and seeing the need to have a forum for discussion and presentation. And to Carice St. Hilaire Clark for co-chairing and organizing the workshop, and to Caroline Sferaza for her help with logistics and support. And thanks in advance to all of you for what I'm sure is going to be another great day of talks and thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Molly. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for day 2. Shannon Zank is the director of the National Institute of Nursing Research here at NIH. And the title of her talk is Traffic and Social and Structural Determinants of Health. Shannon, can you share your screen?
Sure.
There you are.
Hi.
Hi.
Let's see, hold on just a minute. How is that?
That's perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Roberts, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I really appreciate the invitation to participate in today's event and this really great meeting, in part because of my own personal research interests in the environment and how it connects to social determinants of health. So, but I'm also really pleased to share that the issue of traffic and its impact on health is also of interest to the National Institute of Nursing Research. And in particular, because of its ties to social determinants of health, which, as you know, is really referring to the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, play, and age. So during this session, I'm excited that we will all hear about the health impacts of traffic noise exposure, as well as about older adults and their decision-making around driving. So the way I'd like to approach this issue is from the perspective of structural factors that influence related social determinants of health and their role in inequitable exposure to traffic and its related health effects. And I'll also share some thoughts about the potential for NINR to help contribute in partnership with NIA to solving these inequities. So first, I thought I would tell you a little bit about how we approach research at NINR and the unique perspective that nurse scientists bring to biomedical research. So as our name suggests, nurses are at the heart of everything we do. Nurses interact closely with individuals and families across a variety of settings. In hospitals and clinics, which is what most people think about, but also in schools and workplaces, in homes and justice settings, and in communities from urban to suburban to rural. Our work across communities gives us a very deep understanding of the personal as well as the societal factors that lead to health among some and illness among others. Our research with nursing's perspective at its core is not focused on a distinct health condition or a life stage, but really on health solutions for people in the context of their lives and living conditions, and across all those variety of settings where nurses practice. So with this perspective, we are ideally positioned to contribute to research examining the structural and social determinants of health that play an important role in advancing health equity for all Americans, including older adults. So there are multiple conceptualizations of social determinants of health in the literature, but here's my perspective. Structural factors encompass the economic, legal, political, regulatory, and cultural forces and systems, such as public and institutional policies that shape the distribution of power, resources, and the conditions of daily life across society, as well as people's social position within society. Structural factors shape whether the resources and opportunities necessary for health are equally distributed in society. These structural factors are closely tied to other social determinants of health. They include living environments such as proximity to high traffic roadways. Structural and social factors shape health for better or for worse, and they impact both individual health as well as population health across diseases and conditions, population groups, and as we're focused on today, life course stages. At NINR, we recognize the importance of structural and social factors for both individual and community health and acknowledge that they are major drivers of health inequities. Healthy people, as well as the CDC group, social determinants of health into 5 domains, one of which is the neighborhood and built environment. I'm glad to hear that the built environment is a focus of today's session. So as you probably know, the built environment includes all of the physical parts of where we live and work that have been modified by people or society, like our homes, buildings, streets, open spaces, and infrastructure. And that also includes roads, bridges, and transportation systems that we use to get from place to place. Broadly speaking, older adults interact with the built environment in ways that reflect changing lifestyles and changing physical capabilities in some situations. After retirement, people often have more time to enjoy parks, recreational spaces, and other community facilities. At the same time, conditions such as chronic diseases and limited vision may restrict mobility and create special needs. For example, an older adult who is no longer able to drive, but who lives in an urban area with buses, transit, and other transportation options might be able to stay mobile well beyond the capacity of an older adult who lives in a suburban community. The bottom line is the built environment is a critical component of healthy aging. And as we are learning, traffic in these built environments and the noise and pollution that comes with it is increasingly impacting our ability to age well. So as I open my talk, I mentioned inequitable exposure to traffic and its related health effects. So why is that? Most of us have probably noticed that the difference in traffic noise, volume, and density between suburban and urban neighborhoods, and perhaps assume that traffic was an unavoidable consequence of city living. However, that isn't necessarily the case. During construction of the nation's interstate highway system, roughly from the late 1950s through the early 1970s, federal dollars paid for the roadways, but state and local officials selected their paths. Thus, interstate highways were often routed through poor neighborhoods and very often through Black neighborhoods. Nearly 40,000 urban housing units per year were being demolished by the 1960s to make room for highways. But little thought was often given to the wide range of impacts on the affected communities and on the families that were displaced. For example, established community resources like schools, churches, and business districts that serve predominantly Black communities were lost to highway construction, contributing to the underdevelopment of these communities. This underdevelopment contributed to further perpetuating the disadvantages for Black communities when it came to economic opportunities as well as their benefits. Communities were literally divided by the new highways, disrupting established social networks and ties and reinforcing neighborhood segregation. And though lower income and racial minority communities were disproportionately displaced by highway construction, these same populations today live nearer to high traffic roadways than do white, wealthier counterparts. The health impact of such proximity to noise and pollution that accompanies these roadways is well known, and many of these are being discussed today by my colleagues. However, we must acknowledge that policy decisions made in the past have led to the resulting unequal health burdens that we still see today. So with that brief history and that grounding, let's talk more specifically about how traffic and aging present additional health burdens related to structural and social determinants of health. So for instance, as we age, we tend to move more slowly. As such, older adults need additional time to safely cross busy roadways. We often see pedestrian signage near school zones, as well as well-marked crosswalks, push-button walk timers, and traffic slowing measures. These same measures can also prove helpful for older adults who need to navigate busy roadways as pedestrians. Sorry, just a technical difficulty here. I think I got it. So it's also important to note that sidewalk availability and maintenance is an important aspect of pedestrian safety, even more so for older adults who may already have mobility issues. Curb cuts and well-maintained sidewalks allow for easier use with wheelchairs and walkers, but also make pedestrian travel safer for older adults who may be more prone to stumble with higher curbs and uneven pavement. Without these measures in place, pedestrians are more likely to walk in or very near to traffic lanes. And again, we see inequities. Research shows that sidewalks are in worse condition and not as well maintained in low income and minority neighborhoods than in wealthier, wider neighborhoods. Moreover, the needs of passenger vehicles have historically taken precedence over that of public transit. Over 3 million older adults recently use public transportation, with over 600,000 relying on public transit to see their physician. Lower income and minority neighborhoods too often have poor access to public transit, leading residents to be overburdened with time and reliability concerns, related to commuting for work and other activities. Investments in public transit have the potential to not only relieve some of this burden, but also to reduce pollution, noise, and other aspects of traffic that impact health. So before I close, I wanted to take just another moment to tell you about the social determinants of health related research we're supporting at NINR and its potential to, in collaboration with NIA and others, contribute to furthering this area of science. So last spring, we launched a new strategic plan at the Institute that includes 5 research lenses, which you can see here. One of these lenses is social determinants of health. Through this lens, we aim to identify effective approaches to improve health and quality of life by addressing the conditions of daily life. We want our investigators to address upstream and midstream causes of health outcomes, identify how to limit exposure to adverse social and economic conditions, and how to limit susceptibility to the biological embedding of social determinants. We've begun releasing funding announcements related to these lenses, and research into the impact of the built environment and traffic on aging through these lenses would certainly be of interest and fit into our strategic plan. So here are 2 examples with deadlines that are on a rolling basis that support NINR's interest in optimizing health and advancing health equity through the lens of social determinants of health. With these announcements, we're looking for research projects rooted in nursing's holistic, contextualized approach to address the nation's most pressing and persistent health challenges. And that includes those that come with aging. We also want to support projects that employ innovative and rigorous study designs to inform practice and policy with an emphasis on solutions. Our strategic plan also includes guiding principles or important qualities that all NINR supported work should have going forward. In considering grant applications for funding, the extent to which studies reflect these principles will factor into our decisions. We are interested in supporting research that addresses today's challenges and helps us be better prepared for the future, discover solutions to optimize health across clinical, community, and policy settings, advances equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, and is innovative, applies rigorous research methods, and has the potential for significant impact on health and well-being. So using these lenses and guiding principles, there are a number of opportunities to better understand the interplay of traffic and other social determinants of health and their impact on our health as we get older, and identify those who are disproportionately impacted. So I hope those of you here today will consider these lenses and principles in your own research. So thanks again for allowing me to share my thoughts about how social and structural factors play a role in health and health outcomes as adults age. Certainly feel free to reach out to us at any time, and look forward to further conversations with NIA and the scientific community about this area of science. So thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are there questions? Let's see. Looks like we have one. Okay. We have a question. How much conversation has NINR had with transportation decision makers? And are there any examples of feedback? You're muted.
Thank you. Somehow I got muted. So thanks for the question. No, I agree in general. I think, thinking about how to better collaborate with partners across sectors as well as federal agencies in this space is really important to inform our research. So we're highly interested in that area. It's certainly on our wish list, and couldn't agree that that's really important to move this field forward, especially to get to solutions.
Thank you. And I am the same attendee has another question. Has NINR examined any interventions that could help reduce the adverse impacts of traffic on the elderly? What interventions have the greatest evidential support?
Great question. I don't have the answer to that today. So is it Chad who asked that? Chad, feel free to follow up with us, and we're happy to connect about what research we've supported on that to date, and would be happy to talk more about that.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Dr. Zink? Place them in the chat or in the Q&A, or for panelists, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Going once. Going twice. Okay, so in order to stay on schedule, we'll take a quick break and we'll come back at 1:35. So if anybody needs to step away for a few minutes, you can do that. And if there are any new presenters who would like to test your slides, you can.
Thank you, Lucy. Lucy and I go way back to when I first started my career at NIH some 20 years ago. So she is certainly welcome to abuse me in whatever way she wishes. So the third session today, session 3, is devoted to traffic noise exposure health impacts and driving and aging. And we're going to have 4 presentations. As you can see on the screen here, we're going to have Dr. Courtney Stewart start out with consequences of intense noise exposure, what we can learn from rats, then followed by Dr. Jeanette Peters, transportation noise and cardiovascular risks, then Dr. Emmy Betts on older adults and decision-making about driving. And last but not least, Dr. Matt Rizzo is going to talk about brain in the wild, digital biomarkers, therapeutics, and health. I'll remind you that please use the question and answer part of the platform to enter questions, and please denote whom the question is directed to. We'll do our best to answer the questions live, but those that we can't get to will be answered in follow-up by the presenters. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Dr. Stewart. Take it away, please. Or not.
Sharing my screen now. I had
There you go. Cool.
I had the Zoom window pulled up. Okay. So I'm Courtney Stewart. I'm from the Ann Arbor VA, and have to show a disclaimer before I get started. To an even greater extent than I was aware of prior to this workshop, noise exposure affects everyone. Noise exposure is the second most common cause of acquired hearing loss after aging. 1 in 4 adults between 20 and 69 years of age have audiometric notches that indicate noise-induced hearing loss. In addition to hearing loss, perceptual deficits and tinnitus are also strongly linked to noise overexposure. Although noise exposure is commonly implicated as a cause of acquired hearing loss, the possibility of concomitant vestibular damage is less accepted. But because the sacculus is right behind the oval window, which you can see here, adjacent to the stapes, it's exposed to considerable force from this foot plate. I hope to convince you today that imbalance, dizziness, and fall risk, which have all been observed in human subjects with hearing loss, may indeed be linked to noise-induced vestibular injury. The inner ear, I'm just going to give a quick overview, is located within the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This is the location of the peripheral vestibular system, and here within the bony labyrinth. The labyrinth is a continuous fluid pathway shared between the cochlea and vestibular structures. Externally, we see the bony labyrinth of the inner ear, and this encases the membranous labyrinth here, which contains auditory and vestibular sensory structures. 3 semicircular canal cristae, and which detect angular velocity, and then 2 otolith organs that detect linear acceleration. Although there are 5 vestibular sensory structures within the inner ear, the focus of today's talk will be on the otolith organs. The saccule rests directly behind the footplate of the stapes and senses vertical linear acceleration, and the utricle, positioned at 90 degrees to the saccule, senses horizontal linear accelerations. The vestibular apparatus is closely positioned to the cochlea, so you can see it adjacent right here. So it is possible that sound waves which activate the cochlea also reach the vestibular structures, particularly the otolith organs. To the right, you see a diagram created by Anka Velizar, the engineer in my collaborator Natella Shenitsy's lab at the Smith Kettlewell Eye Research Institute in San Francisco. It is well known that noise exposure can cause hearing loss. It has also been established that noise exposure causes reduced vestibular function in human and animal studies. Some epidemiological evidence shown here by this dotted line also suggests that noise exposure is a factor that leads to increased fall risk, especially in older adults. To look at lifetime noise exposure, we use the Noise Exposure Structured Interview, an extremely detailed questionnaire that examines human subjects' recreational and occupational noise exposure, as well as experience with firearms across the lifespan. And I should say before I go forwards, this is my collaborators' human data. We're working on parallel studies through R01 funded research from NIA and NIDCD to understand the interaction between noise exposure and aging of the inner ear. The NESI takes into account the duration of the noise, the use and type of ear protection, as well as the approximate noise level. In this plot, the creators of the NESI show that the distribution of lifetime noise exposure scores they obtained for a sample of musicians in purple and non-musicians. Here we have audiograms that don't reach the musician peak, and many have minimal threshold shifts. There are some dotted lines to show older adults over the age of 60, and then solid lines to show adults under the age of 60. And degree of noise exposure is also color coded. So you can see here very low levels of noise exposure are light blue, up to very high levels, which are dark blue. And to give you an idea, the darkest blue line is a 42-year-old professional DJ, and the middle blue line is a scientist mom with a score of approximately 1. And you might notice here that while age is clearly a factor in separating out these audiograms, noise exposure might not really give us a lot of information about how this distribution works out. We do have yet to collect higher exposed individuals, and so we'll see how that works out. While there are other options to test otolith function, we wanted to start with a test that was simple, could be done anywhere, and didn't require too much specialized equipment. So we're looking here at verticality judgments, the Shenitsy lab, under 2 conditions: judgment of subjective visual vertical with the head upright, where a person's asked to orient this white bar here to the vertical position in their opinion in the absence of visual cues, and then again with their head tilted, and this removes the head as a reference. And perception of verticality is a measure of otolith function that is important for orienting and navigating in the world. On the right, you see that verticality judgment errors are significantly correlated with lifetime noise exposure, quantified with NESI. There are limitations to human research. Human subjects with moderate exposure have a compromised ability to judge verticality, and this suggests an otolith organ injury. It's not possible to examine the otolith organs of human subjects directly, and it's also not possible to zero in on the specific level of controlled noise exposure in human subjects. But using my RAP model, we can precisely deliver noise exposure at the non-musician peak of cumulative noise and evaluate how noise affects vestibular sensory epithelia, physiological responses to jerk, and motor performance. Therefore, a RAP model is used to explore the effects of noise on the vestibular periphery. We evaluated 3 aspects of noise-induced vestibular injury: morphology, physiology, and behavior. Our first question is morphological. How does noise damage the vestibular periphery? Vestibular hair cells have cell bodies of 2 different morphologies. type 1 here, which is flask shaped, and then a more cylindrical type 2. All have a hair bundle with a single kinocilium and numerous stereocilia connected by tip links. The hair bundle is displaced by motion of fluid through the labyrinth to stretch the tip links and activate hair cells. There are 2 types of terminals that innervate hair cells, the calyx and the bouton. And these arise from 3 populations of afferents. Calyx-only afferents are the most irregular and occur specifically in central zones of the vestibular structures of the ear. Bouton-only afferents are extremely regular, and then dimorphic afferents, which are by far the largest population of afferents, have a range of physiological properties depending on their location within the sensory structures. Centrally, they tend to have more irregular firing rates with large gain in phase, and more peripherally, they tend to fire more regularly with smaller gains in phases. Irregular calyx-only afferents are also most sensitive to sound. Therefore, we hypothesize that they are also most susceptible to noise exposure. As I stated in the previous slide, calyx-only terminals are only found in the central or the striatal zone, and calretin expressed by these afferents can be labeled and quantified. To do this, we selected these 100 by 200 micron regions of interest that you can see are here kind of in this middle bend of each end organ. And then we counted how many calyces were labeled with calretin. And I'm sorry, I think that I'm pointing at presenter view. So we're looking at these bends in these 100 by 200 micron regions of interest. And we want to know how many calyces are present. And indeed, 28 days after noise exposure, there is a decrease in calretin expression in calyx-only afferents, innervating the saccule here and the utricle. The strialar band outlined in white is both narrower after noise exposure and less densely filled versus control. If this is the case, will we also see reduced responses to a stimulus that activates these structures? Or does noise-induced damage cause measurable peripheral dysfunction? The vestibular short latency evoked potential is a far-field potential evoked by linear acceleration of the head, and the accelerations that we use can be seen here. This is thought to be a test of eighth nerve and central activity, so we'll get into that in just a second, arising from otolith organ activation. The P1N1 wave is thought to arise from the vestibular nerve, and the P2N2 is thought to arise from the brainstem, from the vestibular nuclear complex. Indeed, we see that a single 120 dB SPL noise exposure causes VSCTP deficits that do not recover 1 month after noise. Prior to noise, we see well-defined peaks at the P1 and P2, even in response to the smallest stimulus. After noise exposure, we see a significant reduction in all traces, with the exception of the 0.32, where we see a complete wipeout. As expected, response amplitudes to all stimulus levels are significantly reduced peripherally and centrally, and latency is also prolonged. Taken together, this data suggests that responses occur more slowly and less synchronously. So our final question was, is peripheral vestibular dysfunction associated with decreased agility? We used a balance beam crossing task to measure rats' motor performance before and after noise exposure. Trial start and stop times were objectively identified with 2 infrared sensors at this S1 start and S2 stop point. Rats crossed the balance beam 10 times per day, twice per week, and 1 week is a single data point on this slide. Each time point represents the average plus or minus standard error of the mean of 2 experimental days or 1 complete week of data. Average pre and post noise exposure time points for 6 rats are plotted and compared with repeated measures ANOVA, followed by pairwise comparisons. Of the 6 rats that we've measured here, they had very stable balance beam crossing times for 6 weeks prior to noise. After noise exposure, crossing times were elevated significantly versus every pre-noise baseline time point for 2 weeks. 3, 4, and 5 weeks after noise exposure, rats' crossing times remained elevated, but were no longer statistically significant versus every single baseline time point. And here at the post-noise time points, we're reporting our highest p-values. So the effect is still noticeable here, but we probably just need a little more data. And so we can conclude that our human subject data demonstrates a significant correlation between increases in verticality judgment errors with head tilt and noise exposure. And this suggests otolith organ dysfunction. We explored noise-induced otolith organ damage further in rats at the cellular, physiological, and behavioral levels. Rats that have been noise exposed have fewer calyx-only afferent terminals labeled with calretin in the saccule and utricle, reduced VSEP amplitude and prolonged latency, suggesting otolith organ dysfunction, as well as increased balance beam crossing times 1 and 2 weeks after noise exposure. Taken together, these findings suggest that noise exposure causes measurable otolith organ damage, and this damage impacts verticality judgments in human studies and motor performance in rat studies. Future work will kind of swap these, although we can't exactly study visual perceptions in rats and get their feedback. We can do quite a number of experiments that will get at the visual system and oculomotor control. And so with that, I'd like to thank the many, many people that have contributed to this project and supported me as I collected all of this data. And I can take questions. Here are some references.
Great, thanks a lot, Courtney. Super interesting work. There is a question in the Q&A that has to do with a difference between Schultz 1992 FICON 12.5% highly annoyed at 65 DNL versus Miller NES 2021 at 20% highly annoyed at 50 DNL. And the question is whether you have an opinion on the striking sensitivity difference between those.
I'm not really very familiar with subjective measures of noisy environments, and I'd love to talk about it offline.
Okay, fair enough. I don't see any other questions, and in the interest of making sure that we get to the end of the session.
Yeah. Question?
Oh, sure.
Quickly. So Courtney, yesterday we discussed indoor noise pollution, and I posed the question whether older adults with hearing loss who turn their television sets up higher to be able to hear it, are they doing themselves more damage to their hearing and to their vestibular system by doing that?
I don't have measures to prove that as a basic scientist, but I would say that unless they have conductive hearing loss, they are likely continuing to damage their ear.
Thank you.
You're muted, Dana.
I was just picking on Lucy, exerting her authority over the session by asking a question. All right, thanks. Thanks again, Courtney. We're going to turn next to Jeanette.
Thank you.
And it looks like, Jeanette, you're queued up and ready to go. Take it away.
Thank you. Let me pull up my slides. So can everyone see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I thank the presenters for inviting me to talk today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we've done on transportation noise and cardiovascular risk, and then end with a little bit of where I see we need to go or we could go in the future. So we had a lot of talks yesterday that included noise. And in 2018, the World Health Organization sort of updated its guidelines from its 1999 guidelines. And in it, it again said that there's strong evidence of noise being one of the top environmental hazards. And even with all that, and we heard a little bit from some of the speakers, including Jennifer Weave yesterday, about the number of people in the US that are exposed to noise because of some of our regulatory decisions in not funding noise in the Noise Act in EPA after the 1982. We weren't doing a lot of noise research in this country. And the way I got into noise is, of course, aviation noise, because planes travel internationally. And so the idea of other countries saying, okay, US, what are you doing with noise? So because of that, the Federal Aviation Administration, as part of its Center of Excellence, started to fund studies looking at cardiovascular disease and aircraft noise. And this is a study that's been ongoing for quite a while. And we were looking at aircraft noise and hypertension and cardiovascular disease in the nurses' health study. So this is work we're doing with Francine Layden, who is going to be speaking later. And then we got a little bolster again in terms of our funding and the work we could do when the Congress put as part of FAA's reauthorization in Section 189 that studies of the potential health and economic impacts of overflight noise needed to be done. And at that point, we added a little bit more on sleep disturbance, and our collaborators out of MIT started looking at economic impacts of overflights. And so to do this work, we were provided by the Volpe Center with aircraft noise models for 90 of the US airports. It was using the Aviation Environmental Design Tool, which is usually used for environmental assessments over a long period of time. And our measurements started at 45 dB and went up. And one of the things I just wanted to point out why we were so happy we had noise data over time is that you can see this as a graphic of noise contours over Chicago Airport between 1979 and 2004. You can see how things can change over time by changes in operations and runway alignments and new runways, etc. So I wanted to illustrate some of the results that we are finding in as part of this research. And the first one is looking at noise and sleep. And this is work being done by my former postdoc, Matt Boziger, who is now at OSU. And we were looking at the Nurses' Health Study 1 participants using as our exposure annualized night average noise exposure. And our two outcomes of interest was sleep insufficiency, defined as less than 6 hours per night. And these were repeated measurements. So in multiple cycles of the Nurses' Health Study, they had been asked this question. And then a kind of question looking at poor sleep quality, and this was only asked at one time point. And so these are some of the results we are finding. So the first model is just controlling for age, with the second model adding other demographic and lifestyle factors and comorbidities. And then the third, which would be of interest to some in this group, we were looking at a number of controlling for a number of ambient factors. So in this cohort, there is a measure of air pollution, PM 2.5, but there were also measurements of greenness and measurements of light at night, which we used to control. The light at night was really significantly correlated with population density. And so we made a choice to use light at night instead of population density, but the results were kind of the same. So looking at these, you get to see a marked relationship with sleep insufficiency with high nighttime noise. Another thing that we looked at is in the Nurses' Health Study and the Nurses' Health Study 2, using both average day-night levels, which we have published on, and then we're now looking at nighttime levels, using as a cut point, I should have here 45 decibels instead of 50, looking at basic model and then adjusted models for both nighttime and day-night levels in both the Nurses' Health Study and Nurses' Health Study 2. And you can see some indication that sleep disturbance might be a major pathway by which noise is affecting hypertension. So another project that we have worked on is looking at aircraft noise and cardiovascular disease in the Women's Health Initiative. And in that study, we tried a little bit to add road traffic noise. And so here is an example of a contour of an aircraft where the blue indicates the runway extent. And then looking just at that contour, looking at modeled road traffic noise. And so this is just a beginning of us trying to look at road traffic noise and then kind of quantify it to look at combined effect of transportation noise, so not just aircraft noise, but how we combine it. So for a study in CHAPS, and this study is being led by Jennifer Weeb, who you heard from yesterday, we were able to expand some of our measurements to cover the Chicago metropolitan area. And this is using a software called Cadna, and again, for over a number of years, starting at 35 decibels. So this work is in its infancy, and this is just telling you a little bit about Jennifer's study and where we're adding the transportation noise piece to it and using the cohort of the Chicago Health and Aging project. Just a little bit of what we're seeing in terms of the participants, in terms of measures of air, which is in the blue, and measures of road, which is in the red, over the number of years. And you can see that people are really exposed to a lot higher road traffic noise in general in this cohort, keeping in mind where we are truncated at the bottom. But we're looking forward to looking at transportation noise. And one of my doctoral students, Stephanie Grady, is going to be looking at road traffic and aircraft noise with some of the biomarkers of neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration. So more to come on that. So looking to the future, things that I've been thinking about is how do we better assess noise exposure? So we have some measures of aircraft noise exposure. And so we could think about whether our measures of aircraft noise exposure using, for example, day-night levels or night levels are the best metrics. How could we improve our measures? So some of our measurements are not as precise as they could be. There's a lot more new technology, use of GPS that could get us better measurements of aircraft noise, more precise. And then, as we talked about a lot yesterday, the idea of having road traffic noise. As you can see, that people are exposed to more road traffic noise, more people are exposed to road traffic noise, and they're exposed at higher levels. And so you notice a lot of the studies coming out of Europe when we're looking at, for example, dementia, are using road traffic noise because there's just a whole lot more people exposed to that. So how do we best measure road traffic noise, given, as Joel talked about yesterday, that a lot is not gathered on a national scale. A lot of it is done state by state, and different states do measurements in different ways. So trying to find ways to creatively begin to better measure and assess road traffic noise. And then also of importance, especially to people who are living close to railways, and how do we quantify, and how do we begin to quantify rail noise? And then to look at that in terms of not just present noise, but historical. So if we want to look at the risk of disease, and in some of these existing cohorts, how could we go back and try to assess exposure in a historical way? The other thing is to look at cohorts with varying exposure. So in the former slides I gave you when I showed you the relationship between nighttime noise, for example, and hypertension, only about less than 2% of the nurses were actually exposed over 45 decibels. So you could imagine that for a lot of the high levels of exposures, this cohort isn't even having that kind of level of exposure. So a lot of the level of exposure is really centered around like the 45 to the lower end. And so we did, one of my former postdocs, Matthew Simon, who's now at Volpe, looked at socio-demographic characteristics of exposure to aircraft noise. And one of the things that came up was members of the Latina communities are usually exposed to higher levels of aircraft noise. So we are in the next cycle of our funding going to look in the Hispanic community health study, or the SOUL study. Thank
1
you.
minute remaining.
Thanks. And then in terms of what Jennifer talked about, the selection bias, survival bias. So if you have a study of people from the Women's Health Initiative, all postmenopausal women, how do we think about survival bias? If noise causes early onset of the disease, are we missing some people who came earlier, the people who are more exposed to noise? And then lastly, looking at not just clinical outcomes, which are very important, like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, but looking at some of the biomarkers, and so we can kind of tease out the etiology. So as we look at charts from Munsell and all that look at maybe these are the possible pathways by which noise might affect health, how could we tease those out? And so I just want, and final, to acknowledge a lot of people who are working on various projects, including people who are here today giving talks like Jennifer Weave and Francine Layden, and just for our funders, both NIEHS, NIA for Jennifer's grant, and then the Federal Aviation Administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Very interesting. Having been to Chicago myself, I think you have an opportunity to look at elevated trains as being particularly a strong source of noise. There is a question in chat, which is from Chad Bailey, and it is, could you explain your decision to use ambient light as a surrogate rather than as a risk factor in itself? Blue light has been found to suppress melatonin production, and night shift workers have been found to have elevated risks for certain health problems. Have you considered ambient light as a risk factor per se for sleep problems?
Yes. So there's another group, and I don't know if Francine wants to talk more about this later, who are actually looking at light at night as a risk factor. So we wanted to look at noise, and we were borrowing that data from someone else. Francine, if you wanted to say more about it.
Well, I'm actually wasn't planning on talking about that today, but yeah, no, there is a lot on that topic though.
So we're not ignoring it. It's just that we were focusing on noise and using it as a control variable, but Francine and their group are using it as the risk factor, which is an important risk factor. Yeah.
Thank you. Lucy, did you have a question? Just checking. I'll take that as a no.
I'll hold my questions till the discussion.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thanks, Jeanette. Next up is Emmy Betts. Emmy, you ready to go? Take it away.
Great, thank you so much. And as an ER physician, I appreciate that attention to night shift work. Let me just get this up and, okay, are you seeing the correct version?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I definitely feel like a little bit of an outsider in a good way. I've learned a bunch, and I'm going to shift gears for us a little bit in the next 10 minutes. I'm at the University of Colorado. I'm an emergency physician and researcher, and I also have an appointment at the VA, and so nothing I'm saying is on behalf of the federal government. So the area of my work is really around helping older adults make decisions ideally for themselves, so as to promote healthy aging and reduce some of the negative effects that can come with driving cessation. We know from prior work that most older adults do outlive safe driving ability by 6 to 10 years. And so there'll be a period of time when they can no longer drive. And so how do we help them and their loved ones make the decision about when that time comes? We know there are risks to driving. For older adults, it's predominantly risk of injury or death to themselves, as opposed to the general public. It's really important that we continue to fight against that stigma. And at the same time, we know that there are a lot of benefits to driving. So independence, being involved in the community, whatever activities are important to that person, mobility and convenience. And so the challenge is balancing those risks and benefits on an individual level. We know from prior work, including some that our group has done, that older adults really want time to prepare for decisions. I mean, I think all of us would recognize that if you were told to stop driving tomorrow, that would be a sort of devastating disruption to your life. So that, yes, they want input from other people, but they want acknowledgement of how emotional these decisions can be. They want decisions to ideally be linked to a context, like a particular diagnosis, and they want time to plan, which then fits really nicely with theories around behavior change, specifically the trans-theoretical model, and thinking about the stages that someone goes through. And so for any kind of behavior, but in this case in particular for mobility, specifically driving, there's a tool called the Assessment of Readiness for Mobility Transitions that was developed by a different group that's really intended to help clinical providers help gauge where a person is on that progression of considering stopping driving. So that it goes from, on the left side, the usual mobility, someone who's driving, they feel like they're doing fine, they're not worried. Perhaps then they start to have some altered mobility, perhaps self-reduction in driving, avoiding highways, avoiding snowstorms and so forth, looking into other options, preparing for change. And then on the right side is really when you have restricted mobility, specifically have ceased driving. The hope is that we can help older adults get to the maintenance phase, where basically they still have their maintained community engagement. They may have less driving because they've stopped driving, but they are still engaged and are able to find ways to get where they want to go. So this is where it gets fun, because there are a lot of things that affect each of these stages, both the way someone might progress through them, but also the outcomes. So our group is particularly interested in things like some of the cognitive factors, so decision-making ability, and attitudinal, so that readiness to transition. But particularly in the context of this workshop, I want to acknowledge the many, many social and environmental factors that will go into this. So, for example, transportation alternatives. Is this someone who lives in Chicago and has elevated trains? Or is it someone in a rural area in Montana who really doesn't have a different way to get around? Also issues around finances and ability to pay for alternative transportation. Whether you live in a city that has a robust alternative infrastructure for older adults, providing free or reduced cost rides and so forth. And then certainly social engagement, whether the person has a network of people around them that they feel like they can trust and that they're willing to ask for help. So what we are really interested in is what kinds of tools might be able to help an older adult in navigating this complex decision. Specifically, we're interested in a decision aid. There's a pre-existing decision aid around driving and driving cessation. And on this next slide, I sort of go through what a decision aid actually does. Specifically, it is intended to help someone identify the decision, then provide knowledge and help someone clarify their own values, their own preferences around something, so that then ideally they make the decision that is right for them. I think we've all been in a situation where maybe you're considering a big purchase or a job move or something like that, and you might feel a lot of ambivalence and you're going back and forth and you weigh the decision. And then when you make the decision, if it feels good to you, you feel a sort of sense of satisfaction. So that's low decision conflict. You feel good about it. You act on that decision. So you then move forward, you buy the thing, you make the move, accept the job. And often will have less regret or blame or negative psychosocial outcomes. And that's the hope here, that it's both about helping someone maintain their mobility, but also reducing the negative psychosocial outcomes that we can see that come with driving cessation. And so the decision aid is really in that sort of second box, decision needs met, is intending to help inform that decision. And on the bottom row of the figure, what you can see are the measures we actually used to track this. So we can look at things like knowledge, alignment with values, self-efficacy, decision conflict scores. I mentioned a low score is good. And then longitudinally, we can look at things like how somebody feels about the decision, and then their life space and depression. So we are currently finishing up our 2-year follow-up in an R01 called the Auto Study, which enrolled older adults from 3 sites in California, Colorado, and Indiana, 301 adults. And these are the main results from the RCT. Again, reminder that DCS scores that are low are good. So basically what we found was that those who were randomized, these are older adults, older drivers, those who were randomized to look at the decision aid versus just an educational website did have lower mean scores. They had less decision conflict and they had higher knowledge compared to the control group. Self-efficacy was unchanged. And to me, another factor that's very important is that 87% said that they would recommend the decision aid to others. So we're now gathering our longitudinal outcomes to look at some of the things like actual driving cessation as well as psychosocial outcomes. I did want to take a minute too, as we were thinking about the environment around people, to mention a sort of natural experiment that occurred for us that was what we think then provided really interesting information. So we started our RCT enrollment in January of 2020. And you all may remember that spring was quite eventful. So we were doing in-person enrollment. Our campus, like most campuses, shut down, and we had to modify our enrollment, but we also had this natural break where we had some drivers that we had enrolled before COVID and then some after the COVID pandemic started. And so we then did an analysis looking at what happened. This was just for 1 year of people, so not the full sample of 300, but what happened to those drivers, in particular, looking at people during COVID and after. So these next few charts show sort of over time on the bottom. The left bit is the pre-COVID, and then you can see the various curves related to COVID. So first off, not surprisingly, we saw a significant reduction in driving. So 70% of drivers who we enrolled during COVID said that they had reduced driving recently, compared to only 26% of those who enrolled before COVID. And it was in multiple ways. So how far they drove, miles per week, trips per week. Also, really interestingly, then we asked among the people who reduced driving, why did they reduce driving? And so here, the sort of red and orange bars were sort of official COVID related things versus kind of financial or other medical reasons. Something I think is interesting is you see the dark red line that kind of starts off very high. That was official orders, like lockdown orders, that then decreased. But you can see over time, the light orange kind of went up. And that people who were reducing driving were doing it more because they just didn't want to go out as much because of COVID. And I'll come back to that in a moment.
1 minute remaining.
Great, thanks. We also looked at alternative transportation over the past few months. Importantly, saw interest and trust in things like rideshare really go down, although it started to rebound then. And then looking at psychosocial outcomes, we did find overall social isolation was higher during COVID, but actually then things like stress and depression were not. Importantly, we did have a pretty educated and affluent sample, so it's important to acknowledge that as a limitation. And then I just want to end, I really find it very important to include the voices of participants. Some of the things that people said as we think about the environment. We heard a lot of people who said they were more concerned about driving during COVID because they were worried if they got into an accident that they would then be exposed to the virus. And then some also who lost confidence. On the flip side, some found that having stayed home during COVID taught them that they didn't need to drive as much, and they actually felt better prepared to transition later. I'm going to end just by telling folks there's another study that is going to have data coming out probably next year that includes actual GPS data. I'm happy to answer questions if people have interest in it. It's 3,000 older adults in 5 sites across the country with a lot of data that's going to, again, be made available to other researchers starting next January. And we're really excited to partner with people who might be interested. But I will stop there and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Emmy. Well done. There was a question that is posed for everybody. So I'm going to save that one about gasoline versus electric vehicles for the general talk. But I was wondering, I'm going to take my own prerogative here and ask a question that occurred to me as you talked. So if there's the decision to stop driving, then you might think that would reduce overall traffic because that's one less vehicle on the road. But then I thought, wait, if you use alternative car, like Lyft or whatever, then there's like doubling the trips for that car because now it's got to go to your place, pick you up and bring you where you have to go. So I'm wondering, do you think in the grand scheme of things, it's a net zero when the older person, just in terms of traffic, is it a net zero for that trade-off?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have a data-based answer for you. I wonder if it might be. It makes me think of one example from one of the senior living communities that we had done some work with that used to have a bus that would drive people to the grocery store and things, right? So that's a good thing in cutting down traffic and pollution. But they found that people didn't really like taking the bus because then they were stigmatized as being part of an older, dark community. So instead, they started arranging Lyft rides for people. So then they were back each in their own car. And so that might be better for the sort of emotional health of the people, but it's probably not good for pollution.
Great, thanks. I didn't see any other questions pop up in the chat yet. So let's turn next to Matt. Matt, looks like you're ready to go. Take it away, please. You are muted, Matt.
No, I am not.
Correct.
So let me share. And I'm sharing. And now I have to hit what?
If you go to presentation mode, I think you'll be good. Like,
All right, I am going to
little-
presentation mode.
that looks good.
We good?
Yep.
All right, well, hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to meet you. And I just want to express thanks to the NIA and NIH in general for support. I think all of the great research we've heard about wouldn't be anywhere without that support. So thank you. And it's great to be included with such a candy store full of smart people here today. So I'm going to talk about using a car as we go through the exposome to monitor health and make predictions of disease. So that's using the vehicle as a healthcare tool. It's measuring real-world behavior, physiology, and experience. It's linking disease to behavior and physiology, and vice versa. I have a few examples to show you, a little bit to say about data analyses, and then added value for public health and precision medicine. So there are sensors everywhere, right? You've heard about the Internet of Things. They're on you, they're in your cars, they're in your homes, and you can combine all that rich data with ecological momentary assessment and self-report to get these amazing phenotypes of behavior in the real world. You know about the brain in the wild in ways that you would never have known about otherwise. And then you get all these novel relationships that you hadn't known about between brain, behavior, mobility, and health, linked to the exposome that we've heard that has pollutants, microparticles, noise, stress. And then if we can figure it out, we can get outcome measures that can be fed to the EMR, used to advance clinical and translational research, help inform new designs for clinical trials, all relevant to what NIH and FDA and all of us want to do. I want to say that FDA considers randomization of real-world data as the highest form of evidence on drug efficacy and patient outcomes in clinical trials. And that's exactly what we're talking about now: naturalistic data, real-world data, observational studies, and we need methods to be able to analyze those data. So let's get into that a little bit. The vehicle is a wonderful potential healthcare tool. Like I said, you can link disease to behavior and link behavior to disease. You can quantify real-world mobility, life space, and exposure, and our older individuals who are at risk for medical disorders, and plenty of them, including dementia. We can track health and predict disease for precision medicine. That in turn can inform and improve patient care. We can intervene early to improve outcomes and reduce disease burden, like what if we intervene early in Alzheimer's disease? We get unprecedented data on health outcomes and treatment effectiveness. We advance clinical trial designs, and importantly, without necessarily even coming to the clinic, you have egalitarian access to care for everyone, everywhere. So this is all the stuff we get. We have the car driving around on top, but we have data from the home, cell phone, ActiWatch, or whatever e-watch you wear. It goes to the cloud. It can be fed to the electronic medical record for good use in healthcare. This is where we are. I'm the PI in this thing called the Great Plains IDEA CTR. Nebraska is a state that goes 500 miles west. We're linked with the Dakotas. We have a bunch of institutions. Those little blue dots are a practice-based research network, which now has 89 sites. So all these people are whizzing around all over the place, and we can measure it to good effect. So why do we want to measure real-world behavior? It's because people behave differently in the real world than they do in the clinic, and that reduces the predictive value of clinical observations. We have an opportunity to link this sort of boots on the ground observations to disease and age-related disorders that we never had otherwise. And that improves our ability to predict and inform interventions on injury reduction, mitigate social isolation and caregiver burden, increase mobility and independence, improve disease detection and tracking, and inform discovery for treatments and cures. So we can link our observations to syndromes, and I give you a number of them here: agnosia, dementia, aphasia. Dementia's in there, of course, multiple conditions, medical conditions, cardiac, psychiatric, multiple metabolic causes, including toxins, which might come from the environment and the exposome, and drugs. Many of them have good effects. They all have side effects. Can we measure them? We can with naturalistic data. You need to have an idea of mechanisms and theories and causal pathways to strengthen causal inference. So an impairment to behavior pathway would be that a stimulus is received by a subject who perceives and attends, plans and executes, depending on executive and motor function. Perception depends on visual and attention function. They do something, they behave, there's an outcome, and with feedback, they can correct the outcome to the desired outcome. The feedback loops are not shown here, but driving is a marvelous way of looking at this impairment to behavior pathway. So how do we do it? Well, in our laboratory, and thanks again to support from NIH, NIA, and others, we have a number of tools that we use. We install cameras in a car. We have these basically computer boxes that have sensor devices in them, accelerometers, GPS, recording capabilities, and they link back to the cloud where we actually get the data. This is a summary of where our subjects have gone. We have about 650 drivers with various conditions, many of them aging and sort of with risk factors for dementia, and driving about 1 million miles. That's a lot of particles. That's a lot of noise. That's a lot of exposure. We know exactly when people went, where they went, how long they stayed there. So this is a marvelous tool for addressing some of the issues that we've heard about in the last couple of days. On the left are the sort of watch devices we use with accelerometers and GPS. On the right, we can measure physiology as well. For example, with diabetes, we can measure how glucose changes in the moment and how that affects behavior and safety. Of course, there are a lot of physiologic measures we can collect, but in the wild, we're restricted. Here's an example that sort of gives you an idea of the sort of individualized data we can get. This is a driver with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome studied in a project with NHLBI. You can see pre-PAP, he was an unsafe driver. He was a drowsy driver, and post-CPAP, which is controlled positive, continuous positive airway pressure, he was more alert. So you can see what happens in the individual and how effective a treatment or exposure is. Here's an example in diabetes. You see a guy who's got type 1 diabetes. He's severely hypoglycemic, about 40 micrograms per deciliter of glucose. And in association with that, in the record, he drove off the roadway, and we have video evidence of that because we have video validation of what happened with our, say, accelerometer recorders and GPS. Here's an example in an older driver with one of our systems driving, and you can see on the right upper portion of the slide that there's a sort of yellowish line tracing that changes abruptly. That's a deceleration. She jams on the brakes. Well, something unsafe happened. What happened? So we can go to the electronic record, correlate it with the video, and we see what happened was a young kid ran in front of the car. You can see the driver on the upper left with her lips sort of pursed, surprised, but she acted safely. She decelerated and she didn't hit the kid. So no fault here. This is an older driver executing a safe behavior that looks unsafe, but we know that it wasn't because we had the video. So we get all of these kind of data, and we can aggregate and analyze them over groups. And so our general data analysis pipeline is shown on the left. We get data on the lower left on the medical record. functional abilities, real world driving and actigraphy. We have quality assurance stages. We have high performance computing. We merge data from GIS and human review and pattern categorization. We use tools like machine learning and computer vision and regular modeling with statistics so we can make inferences on driver behavior, activity, and physiology and model a driver disease.
Minute remaining.
Features, excuse me, I didn't hear you.
1 minute remaining.
Oh, that's good. So I will just go beyond this and say that there are multiple examples of how we can reduce this enormous data set to get things like driver exposure in an individual, to look at how driver exposure relates to their functional abilities, like how does cognition impact driving exposure? Well, drivers with worse cognition drive less. We can look at critical junctures challenging the driver, and I won't go through all of that. Here's an example in Parkinson's disease showing a pilot study with 30 drivers, 30,000 miles, almost 4,000 drives, finding new evidence on how mobility declines on activity are correlated with motor function, UPDRS Part 2, on levodopa equivalence. When you're at stage 3 on the when you're at stage 3 Hain and Yahr, and you have MCI, you have about a 50% chance of developing dementia, something we're interested in studying. We can monitor what goes on in a home, in a family, which is of course related to the exposome. We can do ecological momentary assessment. And let me just mention some research gaps. Please don't cut me off. So we need shared data repositories and analytic tools. We need to address issues with PHI and IT. We need data analysis strategies, and there are multiple of them. We need methods of extracting and contextualizing meaningful performance, behavior metrics, and outcomes, and going from parameters to behavior. We need to figure out medical applications, and systemically and institutionally, I think it's important to recognize that these efforts are very team intensive and data intensive, and that longitudinal support is needed for analytic efforts to mine these data in data repositories, even when the data collection is over. So I will end here, but I want to say that the naturalistic data are definitely part of the exposome. It's one of the factors that we are exposed to in the real world, the risk that we're exposed to, but it also tells us where we go, where there are added extra risks across the lifespan. This is all relevant to what we want to do in terms of prediction and improving healthcare for all. So thank you. And we have a big team to do all of this work. Glad to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Matt. There's a question in the chat that I think actually will be a nice segue into the general question section. And it's specifically for you. It comes from Scott Brown, and it asks a question about what are the legal implications and possible ethical implications of such widespread collection of personal data like driving, GPS, and so on?
I think there are important privacy considerations. I think all the folks who are involved in our projects have signed informed consent. We recognize that things can happen during driving that a person might not want others to know about. So we have certificates of confidentiality in this work. We don't just give out the data. The data are also useful, though. A person may want to know how they do, so we can give a report back to them. But we don't share these data with anyone else. We have to adhere to rigorous PHI standards imposed by the institution that we have to live up to for the NIH. But this is the world we live in right now, and some people are perfectly willing to be recorded all of the time and perfectly willing to put it out there, as you know, from looking at the web. But an important question.
Thanks, Matt. So Lucy, if my clock is right, we still have a few minutes for the open question and answer period. And so
We do.
Great.
Yes,
so
and lots of great questions.
Yeah, there are there are a couple of questions that are directed to everyone. So one of them is a general question for all studying road noise: is there anything that can be done to counteract the detrimental effect of noise. Would listening to music in the car aggravate or diminish the negative impact of noise? How about listening later? So I'm reluctant to call on someone in particular, but Caroline, Courtney talked about noise specifically. So maybe you could take first shot. I'll put you on the spot.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's basically about, is there anything that can be done to counteract the detrimental effect of noise?
So as far as, okay, listening to music in the car, for instance, I don't think that would actually counteract the exposure to a high sound level. It might reduce annoyance from a noise that was unwelcome, but I don't think that it would actually protect your ears. I was actually talking to my dentist yesterday about wearing active noise canceling earplugs so that she could still interact with her patients, but reduce her noise exposure risk during the day, because I was kind of telling her like, this was my day yesterday and like a little bit of the last week. And she was kind of interested in that. So I don't know how many people would actually want to walk around doing active noise cancellation earplugs, but if you're listening to music and you're safely listening to a reasonable sound level, that is, and you had active noise cancellation, it could reduce your risk a little bit, especially if you lived in an urban area.
You also run the risk of being pulled over by the police in certain states if you are listening to some kind of music or have earphones
Yes.
While you're driving. So, you know, there's that part of it also.
Right. I think hearing protection and active noise cancellation earbuds are two separate tools that you could use.
Thank you. Great. Two questions for Jeanette from Jennifer, so you can blame her. Can you talk about the changes in aircraft noise over time, not just Chicago? Have planes gotten louder? Has the use of next gen changed the magnitude of some exposures for some communities? That's one question. Do you want to take that one and then I'll read the second?
Yeah, yes, I'll take that one first. Thank you. Yes, so aircraft noise has changed substantially. So if you listen to how an aircraft, the amount of noise it made in the 1970s, totally different than what it does today. So much, much quieter. And that's in part through advancement in technologies. It's also in part to FAA having 2 periods where they started to phase out louder airplanes. So it's much, much quieter. The other side of that is that we have many more aircraft in the sky than we did in the 1970s. And as part of trying to handle that growing air traffic, this thing of next gen came up. So this was an attempt to modernize air traffic control, air traffic in the sky and make it more efficient, reduce environmental impacts, increase safety. But what it did, it sort of made highways in the sky where instead of the planes being all scattered because of radar, the planes are now coming in like almost like a road. And so if you have the misfortune of living under one of those roads, because of new technologies like was being talked about, like GPS or the RNAV system, area navigation, they could be coming in like every 30 seconds. Like you could hear a plane, as soon as it's gone, 30 seconds, there's another plane. They could be that close behind one another in the sense of your hearing. So communities who are now being pummeled by these this new highway in the sky are really complaining. And that's probably goes to what Wig was talking about, is why is there increased annoyance? There, you could think about it, 65 decibel could be one roaring plane that comes one time in the day, or it could be just lots and lots of little planes coming throughout the day. And you could see how your annoyance and your stress level could very much differ if you have lots of them coming at the same, in an interval. Yeah.
Of course, some airlines like Southwest just randomly cancel all their flights, and that cuts down on the noise a lot, at least the noise in the sky, not the noise at the counter. The second question is, could you comment more on the correlations among noise, air pollutant concentrations, and population density, and the implications of these correlations for questions we can or should ask or can't and shouldn't ask in research?
Okay, another good question. So just looking at one of our studies, for example, in the Women's Health Initiative, and it was similar when we looked in the Nurses Health Study for the measures we have. So the correlation, which is, I think, similar to what we see in some of the European studies, for example, for day-night level and NO2 is like 0.31. So kind of moderate, and then for PM, even lower, like in the 0.10, 0.11 range. So they're not as correlated or co-occurring as you sometimes think in terms of those two measures, PM 2.5 and NO2. There are some groups like Kevin Lane, and I think Wing is involved in that too, looking at ultrafines, which is more of the concern with aircraft noise. And then population density is maybe similar to the relationship between DNL and NO2 is population density. So in thinking of all these things, they're not as co-occurring as we think they are, but there's definitely some trend where they are co-occurring. And so as Jennifer was saying, what questions do we ask and how do we tease out what's happening because of noise and what's happening because of aircraft is something that we have to think about and that we think about a lot. Yeah, even looking at nighttime noise and daytime noise, you think they would be directly correlated, but nighttime noise is even less correlated with traffic because, you know, in nighttime is a lot of the, not people going to the airport, but it's a lot of the FedEx and Amazon traveling in the night. Yeah.
Could I ask a different question?
Yeah.
What about Snell's law? If the ambient sound is quieter and the same noise happens, is it more annoying because it stands out more?
Yes. So that is why day-night level actually has a penalty of 10 decibels for nighttime noise. And in Europe, they have a penalty for evening and then nighttime noise, a penalty of 5 decibels for evening, 10 decibels for nighttime noise because of just that thing, just that phenomena.
So Matt, since you asked a question, now you get to answer one from Lucy. Is it possible using this mind-boggling combination of sensors to estimate noise pollution surrounding the black boxes that are used in your research?
Well, nobody drives who wouldn't be driving otherwise. So there's no extra burden other than what people usually do. Our black boxes don't make any noise. I'd like to say they purr like kittens, but they don't do anything.
But could they collect data about exposures?
They could. And, you know, after our session yesterday, I wrote to Toyota immediately and I said, dudes, opportunity. Can you outfit sensors on your cars so we can collect ambient noise and stuff on pollution? And the guy wrote back to me, great idea. So I think it's possible. It'll cost.
Oh, wow. That's
Danny,
really
it'll cost money.
So for everybody, could air collection sensors be added to the black boxes, or are they too unwieldy for a personal vehicle? So I guess, Matt, you partly answered that, but more broadly, I guess, to the audience, would it be feasible to put these kind of sensors on other places to collect those local data?
Well, I mean, yes. The short answer is yes. And we heard yesterday from a couple of presentations where people do use regular motor. The short answer is it's definitely possible. The long answer is that using very small, energy efficient monitoring devices, so-called low-cost sensors, could easily be added to the kinds of outfitted things that are being talked about, in the last Matt's talk. For the very high quality sort of reference grade measurements, it takes more space, it takes more energy, it takes, ideally you've got something that's instrumented out the top of the car rather than inside the car. So there's lots of other things that you'd want to do it sort of right and better. But definitely there are low cost, low profile monitors that could be added for certain pollutants, including PM 2.5. Reasonably accurately to the profile of stuff that sounds like you're already collecting.
Great, thank you. I recall there was a question earlier, and I'm not finding it right now, but there was a question that came in at some point for everybody about whether the advent of electric vehicles will substantially impact noise pollution caused by cars.
Yes.
And so Jeanette, I see you nodding vigorously. Yes.
Yeah, we were just talking just before this meeting too, so a group from Volpe, and we were just talking about the fact that a lot of noise models now need to be updated for these modern custom cars that are much quieter. Yeah, so the answer is yes.
Not too long ago, I read a New York Times article, though, that also talked about the threat that's posed by electric vehicles in two ways. One is they're quiet, but they can also accelerate at rates that are outrageous compared with gasoline-powered vehicles. And it was in the context of talking about the threat to pedestrians who assume they have time to cross in front of a car that is stopped, only to find out, oops, not. So they may be quieter, but maybe it's better to call it stealthier.
Just to play the devil's advocate, I would say also that they probably won't reduce roadway noise produced by the vehicle's motion. They might only reduce the sounds of the vehicle running, which in a lot of gas-powered cars with mufflers is not shocking. It's large trucks that transport things, in my opinion, that are a bit more offensive to the ears.
I see, Caleb, you have your digital hand raised, please. I can't hear you, but it doesn't look like you're muted either. So not sure what's up with that. Okay, we'll circle back, see if you can figure out your audio connection. Caroline, can you help? Is there any other question or Lucy, I'm missing in the chat?
Sure.
Dana, can I jump in?
Oh, I'm sorry, Emmy, sure, go ahead.
Well, one of the questions was from Emmy, so go ahead.
Yeah, I might ask, and it's sort of maybe for Matt as well. And just following up on the question of electric cars, I also am very curious to see what's going to happen with teen drivers. I'm already terrified about teaching my teenager how to drive in our electric car because of the acceleration sort of worry. So in terms of traffic safety.
So it's more than that. It's also understanding the capabilities of the vehicle. It's the human user interface. It's the added information stream of monitoring the status of the level of automation in the city and on the highway, and knowing when it changes, knowing when it is not functioning properly and needs a human to take over, and that somebody may be, immersed in some game on their cell phone. So there's like all kinds of problems that can happen.
And then, thank you. My question, which I think Caroline also just put in somewhat of an answer to it. So in the long road study, we switched from a sort of black box to a phone-based app for GPS tracking for many reasons. And I was curious about options for tracking things like noise based on cell phone apps. And I don't know, Matt, if your group is doing anything like that.
Well, we could use cell phone apps. We haven't yet. We're thinking about it. It's convenient. On the other hand, you lose a lot because the video validation of what actually happens is critical. And if you want to do some fine-grained behavioral analyses, you need to know what's going on in the vehicle, on the roadway. You need principles of knowing how to analyze that. And I'm wondering how you know who's in the car and driving. You may have the cell phone, but maybe somebody else is driving. So those kind of things are flies in the ointment.
I think also opening up microphone access to these apps while appealing does open a whole nother can of worms about what data you're collecting and what you're going to do with it. So there's a lot of caution needed in that.
Sounds complicated. Here's a question. Sorry, Scott, I had missed it. I saw this earlier and I wanted to ask the group. We have just a couple of minutes left, but I think they're all important questions. This one is, when conducting research on airplane noise health impacts and other environmental exposures, how do you go about addressing racial, ethnic, socioeconomic disparities in flight paths and changes in flight paths which may disproportionately impact diverse communities. This is both a study design statistical question as well as an environmental injustice question. So I don't know, Jeanette, since you're in that airplane noise space.
Yeah, so as I was saying, my former postdoc, Matt Simon, just published a paper looking at the social demographic patterns of aircraft noise exposure. And one of the things we have to always be looking at is controlling for individual level, but also area level social demographic. So what's happening in the area? Is it a low income area? So those kinds of things that also affect health. What we found, as you could imagine, is that airports differ vastly. There's some airports that are in richer neighborhoods. There are some airports where the changes have happened in richer neighborhoods. So, for example, in Boston, and I think if Wig is here, he could attest, there's a lot of uproar about aircraft noise because of this shift that is shifting it into higher income neighborhoods, actually. So we have the Belmont neighborhoods, the Milton neighborhoods that are now up in arm and they have more political power, who are making more noise about aircraft noise. Whereas poorer communities like Chelsea, who are adjacent to the airport, who have had it for years, they don't make as much noise. They have just sort of had so many other things to deal with that they're not up in arms. So it's the point is that there's not just one pattern. It's not that all airports are in low socioeconomic areas. It's again all over the place for all our variables that we're looking at in terms of aircraft noise. So that's something we're really looking into.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop us there because I run the risk of being yelled at if I go beyond our 2:50 time allotment. I will note that there are additional comments posted into the chat, and I want to thank each of our panelists for participating in this session. Job well done, and I'll turn it back to you, Lucy.